Since October 2018, when hundreds and hundreds of women, men, children, elderly decided to depart from San Pedro Sula in Honduras on the Migrant Caravan, or so-called Migrant Caravan, to reach the United States, we felt that it was important to learn more about the situation, to be able to stand in solidarity with the communities that are traveling. We understand that there's over 5,000 kilometer journey that people are making out, leaving Honduras, Guatemala, all the way through Mexico and up to the US-Mexico border. We really understand that it's a serious situation for these communities. So because we're so far, apparently, supposedly, right, from that US-Mexico border, we felt that we really needed to understand better what is happening there in order for us to stand in solidarity with the communities that are in the Migrant Caravan. And so this is the reason why we felt that it was important for us to hold this webinar. And we have very special guests with us this evening. The first person that will be speaking with us, Jackie McVicar, is currently in Guatemala City. She's one of the members of the Atlantic Region Solidarity Network in Canada, and also collaborates with the Guatemalan Human Rights Commission in DC in the United States. I know that she has been very much involved with Indigenous sovereignty, working to defend human rights in Guatemala and Honduras. So she's we're really happy to be sharing with her this evening. The next person that will speak after her will be Yurissa Varela. Yurissa is one of the co-organizers of the Honduro-Canada Solidarity Community in Ottawa. This is a grassroots organization made up of Honduran diaspora living in Canada. And she, as a Honduran that migrated in the 1980s, fleeing the political persecution, will be able to speak as well about that Canadian perspective of what is happening with people, why are they having to flee the region. And she's also a graduate student in the University of Ottawa. And so we'll be speaking with her. She can tell us a little bit more about her work. And then the third person that we will have, she'll be joining our meeting around 5 o'clock, is Lulu Varela. She is a University of California, Berkeley graduate who's doing a lot of research. She's actually right now presenting some of her work at the university, so this is why she'll be joining us at 5 o'clock. She's also a member of the School of the Americas Watch in the Bay Area in Berkeley, and so she's going to speak to us a little bit about what is happening at the US-Mexico border.
Welcome everyone, and thanks very much Wendy and Steve and all the folks at CoDev for taking time to organize this webinar. My name is Jackie McVicar, as Wendy said. I've been working and living in Guatemala for the past 15 or so years, and my work started with a grassroots solidarity network on the east coast of Canada called the Maritime Guatemala Breaking the Silence Network. And just before that, I got involved with a network called the Atlantic Region Solidarity Network. And through my experience of living here, I think I was asked to speak a little bit about what's happening here on the ground and what are some of what's happening with migrant caravans. Migrant caravans are kind of new for some of us. Definitely the word, the way it's being used is new language, but the reality is that hundreds, thousands of Central Americans leave their homes hundreds are reported to leave every day, thousands, tens of thousands every year. In Guatemala and Honduras, their numbers vary a little bit, but over the years, between 30 and 40,000 people are deported every year. So you can imagine how many people make their way north for that many people to be deported, and that's only from the United States. There's thousands more that are stuck in limbo. They're somewhere in New Mexico, and oftentimes have their status there have no status there. So it also makes it difficult to work and live there as they figure out whether they're going to try and continue their journey north or come back home. The migrant caravans that happened in the fall that kind of sparked, I think, a lot of attention also because at the time there were elections happening in the United States, and it became a huge political something to talk about, and the wall, which has led to now this major shutdown in the United States, which I'm sure we'll hear more about, so I won't get into that. But I think that, like any major event that happened in the world, it kind of depends on the political moment at the time and what's happening in the United States often, for that to either kind of become a media headline or not. And so I think the combination of a lot of things happened in this fall that gave rise to a lot of attention being put on the thousands of people who are leaving Honduras and making their way north. At the time of the caravan first leaving, I was in Honduras. I was in Tegucigalpa actually, but very aware of what was happening and folks who were leaving. It started out as, just to explain a little bit about how people are organizing a little bit on the ground. In San Pedro Sula, there's a large bus terminal, and often that's where people would come together to start out on their journey north. It's not uncommon for people to have to pay a huge sum of money to try and migrate north. So they pay middlemen, or what sometimes people call coyotes, who are people in the middle who are paid to help people. Basically, they're human traffickers who are trying to get people through different routes through Mexico and across the US border. In Guatemala, it varies. But since I first came here 15 years ago, the phenomena of people leaving to go north is not, it's always been there. The numbers are actually not increasing significantly, although they are going up. There are different types of people who are leaving now, though, because of the situation that's changing on the ground. So I'll talk a little bit about that as well. It's not uncommon, though, I was going to say, for people to have to pay $5,000 to $7,000 in order to pay a coyote to get them to the United States. So you can imagine the huge debt that people take on even before they get to the United States. And so part of the reason that people started to come together in a caravan was to try and avoid having to pay these really high fees, and also for the added security, because a lot of times of what happens is that people are, if they're traveling alone or in smaller groups of 5 or 10 people, they're often attacked. Women are often sexually assaulted. People are robbed. And so the idea of going with a caravan, especially what we saw in the fall, is this huge, massive group of people. Although there were sections of people that broke off, there was this unified effort to kind of stay together. And I think a big part of that was because of safety. So the reality in Honduras and Guatemala, which I'll talk a little bit about, I know have less experience in El Salvador, but there's also reports of people, the same types of numbers from El Salvador, folks obviously leaving to migrate. This week on Monday night, around numbers, they're saying now, I saw today around 1,800 people crossed the border this week in a larger caravan, leaving San Pedro Sula and crossing the border, and many of those people are now in Guatemala City. Some people are actually already at the Mexican border. They left early this morning. I went to a shelter last night in Guatemala City, where there were the shelter was full. There were hundreds of people, ranging from babies to middle-aged people. I didn't see a lot of elderly people, but I wasn't there also that long. But some of those people have already left at first light to try and make their way to the border between Guatemala and Mexico, the Tecunuman border. The reality is that Honduras and Guatemala, for folks who watch a little bit the region, you'll know a lot of this, and for others, the political instability, the economic instability, and part of the political crisis that are happening in both countries are, I think, definitely a contributing factor to the reasons why people are leaving. There's structural violence that we've seen, especially in Honduras since the 2009 coup d'etat, that really the militarization of public security, the militarization of communities has increased dramatically. I was in Honduras with a delegation with a group called Foro de Mujeres, which is a group of I think 19 organizations, women's organizations across the country. They said the number one reason that women migrate, though, is to escape family violence. So you see a lot of women leaving their homes with their kids because of the threats that they receive at home, the fact that there's such high rates of impunity, that they feel trapped, that they can't get out. This is very similar. There was a case last year of a woman, a Guatemalan woman, and I'm forgetting her name right now, but she was the first woman who was going to charge ICE for separating her from her son. And she was a Guatemalan woman, and when they asked why she had left her home in Guatemala, it was to escape the physical and family violence that she was experiencing. She said she had no other way to get out. She was afraid that she was going to be killed. She was afraid that her son was going to be killed. And so I think that is a reality that many, many women are facing. So structural violence, the impunity, especially related to women, violence against women, is a major driving factor, and I think that's why we see so many families now, kids going with their moms to escape that violence. Of course, economic factors are huge, and that can be a range. I think there's lots of reasons why people leave and decide to migrate. Some want to. I mean, I live in Guatemala, you know, like people move and people, there's also people have the right to migrate, to do the things that they feel like they want to do. And so some people think, you know, there is no future for me here. I even know, I was talking to a young man not too long ago. He has what I would think of like a fairly okay job, but he was just like, I'll never make enough money ever to like have a house or, you know, on my own, or be able to just like enjoy my life. I'm always going to be living paycheck to paycheck to paycheck. And so I think the economic policies that we see, the fact that so many people are still living on so little, even if they have jobs, they're living on so little that it makes life really, really hard for people. And so there's kind of this promise or an idea of trying to get ahead. And so lots of people also want to, whether it's for a short term or longer term, migrate so that they can get paid a decent, a dignified salary, which is also very legitimate. There's also people who are fleeing because of the violence, the criminal gang violence. I think I mentioned already that the structural violence that we see in the militarization, both in Guatemala and Honduras, many people in the past 15 or so years through, you know, CAFTA, the free trade agreements and other trade agreements that are happening in the region have really increased dispossession of communities, forcing people off their lands so that they're forced to live in the city where it's even harder to get by. And so I think taking people off their territory is also, in a way, cutting their connection to their homelands. And that has a lot to do with political and economic policies that are happening in the region. I think I don't know if I have, I think I have a couple more minutes. I'm not sure.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So, so I just wanted to say the other thing, because I think there's a lot of Canadians in the call. one of the major driving factors, I think, talking about land and dispossession of land and territory is, of course, mining and extractivism in indigenous territories, both in Honduras and Guatemala. There's, a lot of Canadian mining that have forced people off their land, but also I think beyond that is the role that Canadian economic players like Canadian mining companies have had in supporting regimes like the ones that we see in Honduras and Guatemala. So it's not only just taking people off their land, but they're actually helping prop up these governments that have no support from the population. What we saw a year or just over a year ago with the elections in Honduras, the Canadian government, in the end, completely supported the fraudulent elections that saw Juan Orlando and Mendez take power. There's still political prisoners in jail. There's still extreme violence. The other major thing is that in these countries, Honduras and Guatemala, you see the levels of money that's devoted to health or public education way below what, for example, is set aside for the military, for protecting corporate interests. And so, I think it's one thing to not make that much money, but know that you have a decent public healthcare system or a decent public education system, and kind of getting by day by day is one thing. But when you have absolutely nothing in the public sphere that's going to support you or help you get by, it makes staying here almost impossible. So maybe I'll leave it with that, and if people have questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Yes, and one of the things that we're going to be doing along this webinar is collecting the questions from people, right? So Filiberto, our Labor and Human Rights Director, is taking in some of those comments, and we'll be able to synthesize, and after the 3 presentations, bring the questions to the 3 presenters. I appreciate your presentation, Jackie. The name of the person that you mentioned is Jasmine Juarez, and her daughter is Marie. I don't know how to say her name exactly. The 19-month-old daughter who died in ICE custody. And so I really appreciate you making that comment, because one of the myths that we need to sort of unravel or break away is the fact that it is being said that in the Migrant Caravan is bringing criminals and rapists, that most of it is men. But as you mentioned, there's a lot of women and children also in the caravan. So thank you, Jackie. Yurissa, are you there, Yurissa? I can see that you're, okay, yeah, there's your lovely face. Wonderful. Thank you so much for accepting to participate in this webinar. And as I mentioned at the top of the forum or this webinar, Yurissa is the co-organizer of the Honduro-Canada Solidarity Community based in Ottawa. It's a grassroots group that is made up of Honduran diaspora living now in Canada. She is the daughter of Honduran family that migrated from Honduras to Canada in the 1980s due to political persecution. And she is currently now a graduate student of the University of Ottawa. And know that you also made a recent trip to Mexico and were able to meet with some of the members of the Migrant Caravan there as well. And
so I'll be speaking a little bit on Canada's role in the factors that kind of generate the forced migration from this region, and basically what Canadians can do to support the Caravanistas. So Jackie spoke a little bit on it too as well, so I'll expand a little bit further. Most of the news that we see now is basically focused on the refugees themselves, but what we see is that there's kind of a failure to discuss the root causes of why people are leaving the countries in the first place. So basically poverty, violence, lack of opportunity, those are among some of the reasons. However, how did these countries get like this in the first place is a really important question we should ask. So the reality is that wealthy countries like Canada and the United States, they do have an enormous role in creating the conditions that force people to migrate from the region. For Canada's role in particular, for creating the refugee crisis, it's kind of a big one. So there's two main players for that, and it's basically the Canadian government and Canadian companies, as Jackie had mentioned before. So for Canadian government, their main role has been basically in legitimizing the governments that everyday Hondurans have been denouncing time and time again. So for 2009, when you saw the military coup and the fraudulent elections in 2013, and then most recently the electoral coup in 2017, you had millions of Hondurans going to the streets to protest and basically just saying that their voices weren't being heard and this was an illegitimate government. So instead, through Canadian foreign aid and like trips by the Prime Minister Stephen Harper to go down there after these coups and everything like this, you had the legitimization of these governments by Canadian government itself. So that's kind of where the Honduro-Canada solidarity community kind of was established, because we kept seeing people in Honduras coming out and protesting and trying to get their voices heard, but like Canadian media wasn't picking it up and the Canadian population wasn't really hearing too much about it. So this was something that it's been coming for a while now. So after the coup in 2009, it kind of ushered in about 9 years of repression from the government itself. So Canada, instead of kind of denouncing this and using its role as an international, part of the international community, instead was kind of siding with the government. And then, as Jackie had mentioned, they're kind of propping up the government itself. So in that way, the Canadian government has been kind of responsible for helping to keep this government in power without repercussions. So throughout the 9 years, you've seen like systemic government killings, you've seen criminalization of the local population, and jailing of like political prisoners or prisoners of conscience. So what we have to ask ourselves is, why did the Canadian government continue to legitimize governments that were clearly illegitimate and denounced by the Hondurans themselves? And that brings us to our second point, which is pretty much the Canadian companies. So in this society, we know that money kind of talks and it kind of like makes the world go round, right? So in the way that Canadian business interests were being promoted and expanded in Honduras, particularly in the mining and tourism industries, that was part of the reason why Canada legitimized governments, because they were pro-corporate, kind of more beneficial to Canadian interests. So I'll speak a little bit about the mining and tourism a little bit more so that people have a better understanding of Canadian company roles in Honduras, particularly, because that's the one I'm most familiar with. So for mining especially, Canadian mining companies make up approximately 90% of the mining investment in Honduras. And as we all know, mining is a really contentious issue just around the world. So the operations itself is pretty bad for the environment. So mining uses enormous quantities of water to be able to kind of just separate the ore from the soil. So what this does is basically it uses a lot of the local resources, and in return, what it does is leaves a lot of toxic chemicals and byproducts in the local environment. So in combination with like lax environmental regulations and lack of monitoring by Canadian mining companies, these toxic chemicals make their way into the water resources and then livestock and agriculture, and essentially puts in danger the livelihoods of the local populations. So this has been something that's been widely documented, like in a lot of the reports, and it's been something that's been going on for years as well, but it hasn't been regulated by Canadian government or by the companies themselves. So just to name a couple names, I guess. So the operations, operating within Central America, particularly in Honduras and Guatemala. For example, Gold Corp, it's operating in Guatemala and Honduras, and that's had a lot of contention between local communities. So there's also Aura Minerals, which is operating in Honduras, Hudbay Minerals in Guatemala, Tahoe Resources, KCA Radius Gold, those are both operating in Guatemala as well. So these are kind of something to keep in mind for if these pressures are being put on local communities. This kind of helps perpetuate people to have to move, because one of the people that I had met in November, part of the first Migrant Caravan, he had mentioned, he's like, I have a house in Honduras, but what good is a house if I don't have water to drink? And what good is a house if I have no food to feed my family? So he was migrating north to represent his family, to be able to bring remittances back to them and to be able to have a better life for them. And that's directly the result of Canadian mining companies, because his local community was at stake because their resources were being contaminated by our companies. So investors in these mining companies include Canadian pension funds, shareholders, trusts, and according to Rights Action, a notable organization that's worked within the region for a long time, they reported that except for 2 cases working their way through Canadian courts, no justice or accountability has been done in Honduras, Guatemala, or Canada for any mining-caused violence and killings, harms, and evictions. So instead, the Canadian government has overtly supported the expansion of mining, and a lot of times these mining companies have a lot more power than the countries themselves. So they do have influence within creating legislation that perpetuates their operations and their expansions and things like that. So another section of Canadian companies operating within the region is tourism. So in Honduras, for example, you have Canadian companies and businessmen that are able to establish their businesses benefiting from forced evictions of indigenous Garifuna people from the coast of the country, who get displaced off their lands to kind of make way for the construction of condos and villas that are then marketed to North American and European tourists to be able to go and live in those areas. And then leaving those people displaced with nowhere to go and no resources to kind of to be able to survive off of. A notable person who's been in the news for that has been Randy the Porn King Jorgensen, who's a Canadian. And that's at the center of a lot of contention between Indigenous Garifuna people. So all of this is really basically impactful in the country, and it puts a strain on local communities who have no other option but to migrate because of a repressive government, impunity, like Jackie mentioned, and also lack of resources to survive. So what I wanted to focus on now is kind of what can Canadians do to be able to support these caravanistas? And basically it's at the center of everything is hold our governments and companies accountable for the actions that they're doing down there, because it's so abroad, it's sometimes really far removed from everyday Canadians, but it is important for us to make sure that our governments know that we're watching how we're operating abroad, and that's important to us as well. So Canadian government can be doing more. So they can be, through the refugee program, there's a government-assisted refugees program. Basically, they can bring people from under this program. What they do is they dispatch officials to the ground to identify the most vulnerable refugees. This includes women, children, members of the LGBTQ community, and they can provide protection, essentially. So for the members of the caravan, they're not people fleeing the country because they want to. It's because they're scared for their lives. They're looking for protection for themselves, for their children. And Canada, as a signatory of the Geneva Convention, has a responsibility to act. So this has been done before, and it's something that hasn't been done for this refugee crisis itself, but it's been done in Syria, it's been done in Kosovo. So that's one way we can get our government to act as well. And in addition, we can get the government to actually establish the ombudsman to police Canadian oil and mining operations abroad, which has been a promise that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau had put forward, but hasn't come through with yet. So 5 main actions people and Canadians can do to support caravanistas is essentially, number 1, to write call to our government. So you can do that through contacting local members of parliament, the Minister of Citizenship and Immigration, Ahmed Hussein, or write to the Prime Minister and let them know that this issue is important to you and that there are certain actions that the government of Canada can take to be able to support the caravanistas. Secondly, I would say support organizations doing work directly to help the caravanistas along the route. So this includes organizations like Rights Action, who's been there for a while doing a lot of great work. Pueblos Sin Fronteras is another organization that has been traveling with the Migrant Caravan north, so as kind of like in solidarity. And another thing is that for the people traveling within the caravans, they are generally staying within shelters along the way in different cities. These are called albergues. Albergues are just locally run shelters that are specifically for people migrating north and undocumented. So what you can do is go online to something called Red DH Migrantes. So it has a list of all the albergues that are just along the route, and then you can support those directly. All the information to connect with them directly is there. And that's one way to do it. I would say also participate in solidarity events, rallies, anything to spread the word, basically to help debunk the myths that have been perpetuated about these caravans being full of just criminals and looking to invade. And it's really not, because even when I was down there, it was pregnant women, it was women with children, it was elderly people, it was people from the LGBTQ community, it was just people from all different demographics and walks of life just looking for a better life for themselves and also for their families. Another thing that I've spoken to quite a few people who are doing work down there, and they're saying that a lot of the international community is not present at the moment. And so it would be great if we can get journalists or just delegations of organizations and even journalists to help document and observe what's going on the ground, because a lot of the times you lose contact of what's going on along the route, and that kind of puts people's safety at risk. So the more that the international community is present and understands what's going on, the safer that the people are that are actually participating in the caravans. So overall, those are the main actions that I would say would be helpful to help support the caravanistas and just make sure that we can push the Canadian government and our companies to adopt policies that address the issue and kind of just regulate their operations in a more kind of equitable and a better way. So I think I'll leave it out there, and then if anyone has any questions, I'll feel free to
would like to know, and also for Jackie to explain to us, so what are people, for example, in Guatemala City receiving the migrant caravans, or when you were in Mexico City, Yurissa, what's the greatest necessity in terms of supporting people? Is it food? Is it clothing? Is it water? Is it medical? Some sort of medical attention. What did you see when you were in Mexico City, Yurissa, or Jackie, when you recently visited, downtown Guatemala City?
I would say for when I was in Mexico City, or we were actually in Veracruz, so it was like Puebla, it was called, and it was, what we noticed the most was that within the albergues, it was of course like mattresses and places for people to like stay, and like there was food supplied by local the municipalities, but that kind of depends on each city. Like some people are more supportive and maybe the mayor is not as supportive in other ones. But it was also like transport north. It was just kind of that immediate need, because a lot of people are doing this on foot. So getting north, if they're determined to go north anyway, it'd be great to get help. But also, most importantly, a lot of the people I spoke with were saying that they need just people to stand in solidarity and just like show that they're present and that we're with them, and to kind of just get the word out more into the news, and even just to get our governments to see if we can bring, not everybody of course, but like if we can do what we can to bring some most vulnerable people up here, that would be ideal.
Yeah, just about that, I would agree. I mean, most people are here in Guatemala City. I mean, what the shelters, and so today, for example, the University Students Association opened up shelters and other, like there's church groups and other people doing that type of thing. The reality is though, people are just trying to be here as little time as possible before they continue their journey. And so when they get here, there's often like a medical check, making sure people, are hydrated, which is like the big thing, and that they're ready to set off on their journey the next day. But even the people that were here, that got here last night, many of them were just basically waiting for the crack of dawn to get on the road again and to continue their journey. And so I think what people need is security. They need to get there safely. I think there's some really good journalists, and just talking about journalists, there's a Canadian journalist named Sandra Cuff who followed a lot of the first caravan, and she's reporting on it again. So I would encourage folks to just watch her, and also another journalist named Jeff Abbott, who's also been covering the story, and they're people who are based here, so know the reality. They're based in Central America, and they know the realities really well, and so their reporting reflects that. I think the main thing is getting people safely to where they need to get. We've seen, lots of support in different ways for people to get food and clothes and that type of thing. And of course that's needed, and that can be done, through shelters and that type of thing. But just safety is the big thing. I think crossing the borders is always when people are at a lot of risk, because there's been a big push to militarize the borders and not allow people to cross. So even this group this week, there was a really heightened moment when they weren't going to let the Hondurans pass by. Eventually they did, but now people arriving at the Mexico border, the last time they were intimidated, there was live bullets, and people were injured, and then getting to the next border, obviously then again there's more violence. And so I think calling for safety, a safe passage through the borders is huge. Mexico just announced that it would give Central Americans a visa, a humanitarian visa that would allow them to stay for a year. Similar to, there's like a push, and I don't know, I've just been starting to hear about it more, and I don't know the details of kind of like the United States is trying to kind of start a third, safe third, what's it called? The safe third agreement, like what Canada and United States has. So if you come to the United States, then you can't go to Canada and ask for asylum. And so there's a big push right now with the United States to try and get Mexico to sign a similar type of deal, so that once people got to Mexico, if they claimed asylum, they wouldn't be allowed to do that in the United States. And so I think there's obviously going to be a big pushback against that, especially because in Mexico there's probably not the type of mechanism in place to guarantee people's security, safety. So just to mention that, I think there's safety is like the number one thing that, and stopping, this tearing families apart, and I think those are things that we need to remember, because that's like a whole other issue that we haven't really got into, but of just like family reunification and all the thousands of people that are deported, how that happens, and then what happens when they do get sent back. There's been some terrible stories recently of people that have applied for asylum in the United States and that were rejected, and then have gone back to Honduras and were killed, within a week. So I think the reality is that a lot of people are fleeing situations where their life is at risk. And so ensuring their safety, I think, is something that we really need to push for.
So while we get the questions prepared and to pose them to Yurissa and to Jackie, I just wanted to mention that one of the participants right now in this webinar is Daisy Marquez. Daisy Marquez is a teacher in Honduras from the organization called COPEM. Gracias, Filiberto. And we work directly with the Teachers Union in Honduras. They are now developing a project on non-sexist and inclusive pedagogy, and in the classrooms. And so out of that, and out of the need of the students and the reality that is being experienced by all communities, they realized that it was important to develop a special curriculum to approach the issue of migration and forced migration, and how climate change also has an effect on what we're seeing now, the migration and the crisis that they're experiencing. So I just wanted to mention that she's online right now. If solo si quieres, Daisy, solo te estoy presentando y hablando un poquito del proyecto que ustedes tienen. And so now I would like to present some of the questions that we have. For Jackie, One of the questions is, it says, factors in Honduras and Guatemala that are generating migration. Why traveling in caravan and not in the smaller groups? If you can elaborate a little bit more on that. I think that you mentioned earlier about how, for example, the coyotes will charge from $5,000 to $7,000, right? And how this is one of the reasons, this is one way to not come into that huge debt, as well as the security. But if you can elaborate a little bit more on that, why travel in a caravan and not in smaller groups? That's one of the questions. And also, in what ways have environmental factors influenced the caravan? So both Yurissa and Jackie mentioned mining companies, or for example, the hydroelectric dams. If you can elaborate a little bit more on that, and I guess what is the relationship with that environmental factors in the push of the communities outside of the region?
Thanks for the questions. So yeah, I think my understanding principally of the caravan is really for safety for people. And I think about it like, I keep thinking about myself, and I have a daughter who's 7. I just keep thinking, okay, like, we were forced to leave. How would I do that? And I think if I'm say I was in a really vulnerable situation, whether it be like family violence or economic disparity, and I was like, I need to get out of, I need to do something to change my reality, because it's not like the way I'm living right now. I can't keep going, right? And so I think, especially for people who are in really vulnerable situations, being with other people helps take some of those risks away. And so I think people are really smart by going together. I interviewed this man who, in the first round of caravans in the fall, he's a Honduran journalist, and he started to get blamed for being one of the organizers, and people were saying he was organizing them, and it was like a political stunt and all these things. And so he eventually got detained in Guatemala City and was arbitrarily kept here for a few days before being sent back to Honduras. And I was at the airport when he went back, and he gave quite a few declarations. And really what stuck out to me was that what he said is like, the only reason this has become scandalous now is that because people are doing it together. This has been going on for years, for decades. People, and that's what he was the first person I heard quote the 300 people a day leave Honduras. And then, I went into the official website of the government, and you can see all those stats there. I wrote an article about that. And I can post it here, called "Why Are So Many People Fleeing Honduras?" And the reality is that hundreds of people leave every single day. And so I think what he said was like, it's scandalous now because it's become a problem for the political leaders to have to deal with it, because it's like, it's like in their face, and they have to do something. They have to do something about the reality. But the reality is, this has been going on for a very long time. I think it's because of security. I think it's so that they don't have to pay these coyotes, so that people feel safer. And I think that's probably why you also see families going now, which in a way it's devastating to see an entire family have to feel like they have to leave. But at the same time, they're traveling. It's not everybody sending one person hoping they make it and then can send back some money. It's like the whole family saying, we're gonna do this trip together. And so I think that there's a lot of, it's really smart what people are doing. And I think that in terms of environmental factors, absolutely. I mean, Honduras and Guatemala, El Salvador are countries where the climate change are devastating communities. The reality of access to water is huge. It's a region that Honduras has more water resources, but definitely El Salvador and Guatemala, the levels of fresh water sources for people are very low. And so I think, the dispossession of land, not only around mining, but African palm plantations, which have devastated Honduras and Guatemala in the past couple of decades are obviously driving people from their land that's being extremely contaminated, and all the other reasons too around disposition of land. But I think that the climate change is having a huge impact. You have traditionally people who are subsistence farmers who, it's not raining the way it used to rain here. The rainy season has changed, the dry season has changed, the planting season has changed. And so all of those realities of arid lands becoming more arid, small subsistence farmers not being able to grow the crops the way that they used to, that they as a way to maintain their family or sell locally. They can't predict anymore. Even coffee farmers, small coffee farmers who there's, obviously any kind of farming, there's a lot of variables, but as climate change here in this region is becoming more and more, the evidence of the realities of that it's creating is becoming worse and worse. So I think the types of small subsistence farming is becoming much more difficult for people to rely on. And so people are looking for alternatives and ways that they can have an income for their family. The reality is, I've been thinking a lot about this too, because right now Guatemala is basically going through a coup. There's a coup happening in Guatemala, in case you don't know that. Or we'll have another webinar about that maybe. But the reality, I was thinking, for you to give up a day to go protest against a coup that's happening and that's cutting off all your political and civil rights as a citizen, some people are giving up eating that day because so many people are living day to day, right? And so if you don't go work that day, or if your crops don't produce that, and so it's huge. I mean, for people to actively participate in just surviving is challenging here, So I think that the reality of climate change is having a huge impact, especially in rural communities. And farmers who have historically at least been able to sustain themselves through those means.
Thank you so much, Jackie. And for Yurissa, if folks are wanting to know a little bit more, please share more of the resources so that and what actions we can continue to support. I know that in the chat maybe there's a few links there that you have already shared, and so there's questions about also on how to continue to support the shelters along the way, right? You mentioned some of the organizations already. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about that. And we also wanted to know, do you have information or from the different contacts that you have on what is happening at the U.S.-Mexico border in terms of how the United States government is receiving the asylum seekers, because there's the whole myth around this being an illegal action taken by these communities. And so we want to know about that. I mean, is there an international law? What is the national law in the United States? Does it say that, you can go ask for asylum? If you can elaborate a little bit more on that, please.
Okay, I'm not too familiar with the U.S. domestic law on it, but from the contacts that I have spoken to, they were working along the border in Tijuana, on the Mexican side. But what they said is that now, the Marines and I guess the federal government's kind of taken more, kind of more control of the area, that even organizations, humanitarian ones that were working there, it's really difficult for them to get through. And also for journalists, even there was a lot of curfews put on them and restriction on access. So now I think when they first went there, they were letting me know that it was really, really tense. And I think it was widely reported in the news too that unfortunately, the Mexicans also were getting upset too, people living in the local community. So then it was really intense, but also with the U.S., I did hear that there was vigilantes on the other side as well, even just regular U.S. citizens, I guess, just looking to just, I don't know what they were going to do, but yeah, so I think it's a lot more tense at the border, but I'm not sure what specific legislation has an impact on that. And I know that there was like a list of people being taken to be able to, like, they were only letting like 10 people in at one time or something. So they had a list of like 5,000 people. And I think there was like, they were putting numbers on people's arms to see which ones would go through like in order. So at this point, I mean, I'm not too sure, but we are hoping to be able to plan another delegation down there to see what's going on. But I know that access down there it's really difficult to get any information. And I know that from some of the people I've spoken to, that they've even gone to other cities within Mexico because it's just been so difficult. Because I think even the situation at the albergue Benito Juarez, where a lot of the people part of the migrant were staying, I think that it was getting really unsanitary and everything like that because they weren't letting humanitarian organizations come through and everything like that.
I think there's some really great folks working on the U.S. border, and I think that, you know, I personally think the Canadian government has tried to kind of make this not about Canada, and kind of say, well, this is a U.S. border issue, and you know, we would never do that kind of. I mean, obviously, we have our own very complicated policies around who we do and do not let into our Canada, and the reasons why people are not allowed into Canada. And so I know that there are some really great people. I can put a few resources from the delegation that I was on in the fall up. I know that Yurissa was also mentioning like other delegations to the U.S. border. There's a delegation I know being planned for March, which is being organized by a U.S. organization called SHARE. And I can put that out in case people are interested, and they're gonna, it's called like, it's basically the root, you know, looking at the root reasons of migration. And the delegation is, I think, about a week long, and it's going to be in around San Pedro Sula and Progreso on the north shore, on the north coast of Honduras. So I can put that in there in case people are interested. And I'd be happy to just like put in my contact information, and if anybody wants to message me or stay in touch that way, or have like specific questions that people have. And unfortunately, I don't know. I haven't been to the U.S. border. I think SOA Watch is a great resource, and kind of following them and seeing what the calls are. There were different calls out at different times from different faith-based groups, I know, to, you know, have people come and accompany, to be at the border, to just accompany people through Mexico, especially because things were getting really tense, especially in the fall. So I can put a few links up of places I know and things, but I'll pass it over to Yurissa too.
Okay. Yeah, I think I can keep sending like resources as well, but I'd also say that that as part of like the Honduro-Canada Solidarity Community, I can see if we can arrange ourselves for our group to arrange a delegation down. But that's something I'd have to speak to the group about. But so if anyone's interested, feel free to message me. I can put my email, and also follow us on Facebook, and we can post any updates or anything like that. But yeah, I think the delegation idea has been something that really we were just, people have been doing kind of on an individual basis. But if we can start getting a group together and maybe just a list of anyone who'd be interested, maybe if, and like letting us know, like if you're a journalist or something like that, then maybe we can just get, like arrange it from there. But right now it was just kind of a quick thought. But yeah, no, that's definitely something within the next couple weeks and months that we do want to arrange. So anyone interested, feel free to reach out, and then we can start putting a group together for sure.
So as Keir has asked the presenters to comment on the role of the Canadian pension plan and other Canadian pension investments in forced migration.
Well, there's a couple ways. I mean, the Canadian pension plan is an abyss of terribly invested public funding that goes into all types of criminal activity, which would also be worthy of another webinar about. But for sure, definitely in the fall, one of the things that was happening that we started to see was that the Canadian pension plan is was behind some of the detention centers that ICE was using when they were detaining people at the border. And so there is an urgent action, I think, that Amnesty International was circulating around Canadian pension plan and the investments that they're putting into the detention centers where people are being held. And so that's a really direct way that the Canadian pension plan is contributing. They contribute through mining, they contribute through all types of investments of extractive companies that are displacing people from their communities and other companies.
We now have online or this virtual chat or this virtual hall meeting, Lulu Matute. Hi, Lulu. Thank you so much for joining us. We know that you were in a presentation at the University of Berkeley just like a few minutes ago. But we're so happy that you were able to join us because we want to understand a little bit more about what is happening at the U.S.-Mexico border and how the United States links to this migration crisis that is occurring. So you have the floor.
And I apologize for jumping on this call late. I did just wrap up a presentation on exactly this subject. So I'm glad that the conversation is happening across borders, ¿verdad? Con Canadá, con los Estados Unidos y Mexico. And very briefly, I'll just tell you a bit about myself. My parents are both from Honduras. My mom's a campesina from Olancho. My father from Guatemalan, Honduras, El Caribe. And I was born and raised in Chicago, came out to UC Berkeley, and I co-founded an organization of university students called CAFE, Central Americans for Empowerment. We were the first student-led political organization focused on Central America in the University of California system since our inception, where we're having these conversations around the push factors, right? Why is it that people are leaving? And more importantly, what happens when they leave, right? And what we're finding, and I'm sure Yurissa, Daisy, we're able to draw these connections, ¿verdad? Like in Nicaragua, like in Guatemala, like in Honduras, there is a long history, a long trajectory of U.S. intervention in the country in a plethora of ways, right? There's the political intervention, right, in 2009. So Hondureñas have been ringing the alarm, right? The Miriam Mirandas of the world, the Berta Cáceres of the campos have been ringing the alarm since 2009. Esto no es una situación normal, right? They have been sharing and saying that this is an unconstitutional coup that took place in 2016, an unconstitutional re-election of Juan Orlando Hernandez, where we also see migration on the rise, right? We also see detention on the rise, right? So it's really important to connect these things, the expulsion and the subsequent criminalization of Central Americans, specifically of Hondureños who are on the way. And I'm sure you all know that 1,700 immigrants left today from Honduras and into Guatemala. I spent the holidays, a month and a half in Tijuana, in El Barretal, which is an open air prison, right? There's a euphemism in the US media and in Mexico that these are shelters that are being used, put up, and operated for the protection of Central American migrants, for the protection of Hondurans. This is not the case. I'm going to show you. I've been wearing this around my neck since I came back from the States. I'm going to show you this. This is a compa Nicaragüense, and this is the gafete that they all have to wear, right, in El Barretal. So each and every person is being tagged, monitored. There are arbitrary curfew hours. There are arbitrary checks that go through, like, vamos a checar las carpas ahora, right? So this is an open air prison, El Barretal, which actually just shut down on Tuesday. So the hundreds of families, hundreds of people who were at El Barretal were given a day notice, like, oh, by the way, you need to get out of here, figure it out, right? So what you have now is folks, Centroamericanos, primarily Honduran migrants who are in Tijuana, in Mexico, and other parts as well, but I'll focus on Tijuana specifically, who are in El Barretal, right, in different shelters that are being operated, monitored by La Marina, right? You see AK-47s outside of the doors, right? You get these tags of who's coming in, who's coming out. I, as an American citizen, as a passport holder, and as an academic, I went in, I had to give all my credentials, all of my information, and a statement of intent, like what is the work that I'm doing there, for how long and why. And they would give us a window of visitation, right? An hour, 2 hours. And that was arbitrary, and it changed day by day. Now, when I was there, for 2 weeks specifically that I was in El Barretal, I saw running water for an hour a day, 2 hours a day. And that the running water correlated with the visitation hours. So you get running water when there are visitors from the States, you know, when there are visitors from different organizations, from NGOs, right? So I think there's an important piece there. What happens when accompaniment, what happens when US citizens, passport privileged, when they leave El Barretal? ¿Qué pasa, verdad? And these are the conversations that I've had with mothers, with kids, right? ¿Qué pasa? What do you see? What are you seeing? You know, and to sum it all up, it is an open air prison, right? Which is now shut down. Pero what happens when they're given a short-term notice of you need to evacuate the shelter, which is a euphemism, I would argue, is that for folks, Central American migrants who did not accept Mexican humanitarian visa, they're in limbo, right? So then they are, you know, this category of legality is bestowed on them, on their bodies, and now they're illegal and vulnerable to detention and deportation from Mexico. So I think this is a very important piece. Now, being in Tijuana and crossing, please.
No, keep going, Lulu. Keep going, Lulu. I think that someone was just sort of expressing their agreement with what you were saying. So, and don't have the mic off, but please keep going. We're very interested. This is exactly what we want to hear. Yeah.
Bueno, chévere. Yes, being in Tijuana, being in El Barretal for Christmas, you know, Nochebuena, Año Nuevo, mirar las condiciones que la gente está viviendo ahí, ¿va? Eso no es una situación normal, you know, to quote Berta, who was talking about Honduras, eso no es una situación normal. Now, what I think is equally as important, which we should be talking about, is who's on the ground, you know, who is answering the call to, you know, folks need support. Who's coming down and how are they representing, right? Folks who come in with cameras and who get financial support from different NGOs. How is that money being spent? Where's the accountability piece? Because a lot of what I saw was donations, funding that was being funneled and controlled specifically by the Marina, the Mexican Marina, and that gets lost, right? I think it's, go ahead, Daisy.
Hola, buenas noches. Pues quiero agradecer y en la cual pues, se está tomando muy en cuenta la situación en que estamos viviendo muchas y muchos hondureños, ¿verdad? El fenómeno de la migración en Honduras no es algo nuevo. La gente está migrando desde hace muchos años, solamente que hoy han entendido estos compatriotas que para resguardar su integridad física tienen que salir en grupo y no como lo hacían anteriormente, que salían solos y solas y eran objeto de explotación sexual, de asesinatos, de extorsiones y de muchas otras situaciones que ponían en riesgo su vida principalmente. En el COPEN, el Colegio de Profesores de Educación Media de Honduras, hemos entendido este gran problema que enfrenta el país en el tema de migración. Y desde hace unos 2 años, 3 años, con apoyo de CoDesarrollo Canadá, la Federación de Maestros de Columbia Británica y muchos docentes de Surrey, de Alberta y otros que se han dedicado a apoyarnos solidariamente para que este tema de la migración sea abordado en las aulas de clase. Y hemos trabajado con docentes de 16 departamentos del país, creando y construyendo estrategias para, más que todo, concientizar a nuestros estudiantes de todos estos riesgos que significa ser mujer o ser hombre migrante, ¿verdad? Honduras está viviendo una situación precaria políticamente, económicamente, socialmente y en todos los aspectos bajo el régimen que estamos teniendo, que lo llamamos una dictadura, ¿verdad? Entonces, regresar este año a las aulas de clase y no encontrar muchos y muchas de nuestros estudiantes, pues es una señal de que debemos seguir trabajando en este tema para que nuestros estudiantes, nuestras estudiantes, luchen para que estos gobiernos nos den todas las condiciones que como seres humanos tenemos derecho, a una salud, a una educación, a un trabajo, a vivir con seguridad y que no los asesinen diariamente en las calles de Honduras, ¿verdad? Ese es lo que el reto
Seguro.
que tenemos como docentes.
Sí, estoy completamente en acuerdo y tengo que compartir que algo que está pasando en los Estados Unidos, ¿verdad? En las noticias, en la conversación política, en el debate político, es que quitan las razones políticas que la gente se da, ¿verdad? El perder de las tierras, eso es algo completamente crítico que se tiene que hablar. Yes, vine en Tijuana, vine en el Varela for Christmas, you know, Nochebuena, Año Nuevo, mirar las condiciones que la gente está viviendo ahí, ¿va? Eso no es una situación normal, you know, to quote Berta, who was talking about Honduras, eso no es una situación normal. Now, what I think is equally as important, which we should be talking about, is who's on the ground, you know, who is answering the call to, you know, folks need support. Who's coming down and how are they representing, right? Folks who come in with cameras and who get financial support from different NGOs. How is that money being spent? Where's the accountability piece? Because a lot of what I saw was donations, funding that was being funneled and controlled specifically by the Marina, the Mexican Marina, and that gets lost, right? That there is a process of depoliticization, right? To Daisy's point, it's absolutely critical that we contextualize it with the relationship with the US, right? There's a long trajectory of US intervention since the 80s, right? The logic of the Cold War and anti-communist work in the region, where Honduras has been a strategic geopolitical location to keep Nicaragua in check, you know, to keep El Salvador in check. And today, in today's geopolitics, we can look at the relationship between Brazil, ¿verdad? Colombia, Estados Unidos, that relationship, and connect it to the interests of the US in Venezuela. Now, going back specifically to Éxodo and the Caravana, right? Because I think that's the focus of this conversation, if I'm not mistaken. There's a process of depoliticization that happens, right? So they leave as refugees, as migrants, right? Waving the flag of Honduras, talking about fuera ho, right? Ellos tienen, they have chance, right? Where they're able to articulate and name the fact that the 1982 Cold War Constitution was broken in 2009. And it was broken in 2016 with the unconstitutional re-election of Juan Orlando Hernandez. Now, folks know this and they articulate it. Now, the way that it's being communicated and talked about in well is so the asylum law, who is worthy, who is eligible, ineligible, right? Who is deemed inadmissible, who is deemed admissible, right? And in this whole process, we're not talking about the relationship between the US and Honduras that goes back to the Cold War, right? The monetary relationship, US aid, US funding for the military bases in Honduras, that part is missing out of the conversation. And the last point I would add, Wendy, Yurissa, Daisy, and I'm sure you already have this and you're already wrestling with this. You know, I talked to 30 Honduran women, and una mujer, an elder in her 70s. She told me this. She says, the women are leaving, the kids are leaving, the young men are leaving. They're leaving for their survival, right? But ¿quién se queda? Who's staying? Right? The military base is still there. The military is there, right? The push that was already generated with Honduras' Open for Business Summit in 2010, that is still there. The unconstitutional government is still there. The foreign interests, the hydroelectric companies that want to dam the natural rivers, right? They are still there. And this woman, this elder, right, who had a gafete, she had a GPS monitor on her ankle, right? This criminality, right? This illegality, this making of illegality of this woman, campesina, indígena, right? Who wasn't able to produce a deed to say this land is mine. But memory, she grew up on that land, her mother, her grandmother, her great-grandmother, right? We're talking about a colonial project that has been going on for 500 plus years, right? The fact that they can't produce a document that the current government would honor and say, yes, this is your land. So they're kicked out. This woman migrated, this elder, with her 4 grandkids, separated at the border, right? She spent 4 weeks in detention in the Hilera. And when I met her, like I said, she had a GPS monitor, right? So the illegality, the criminality piece goes far beyond the Hilera when they're released from ICE detention. That surveillance piece is still there. That marking of illegality, whether you go to the States, whether you stay in detention, whether you're deported back. Right now you have a federal crime on you, right? Now you're deemed criminal transnationally. And this woman, I thought her question was so on point, and not enough of us are asking, who stays behind, right? So then you still have these lands that are being lost. Who is sweeping them up? You know, what are the transnational companies? Who are the interests that are coming in and claiming those lands? And I think that's the seed that this mujer planted, right, to ask that question. She planted that seed in me where it's like, yes, you're right. And Miriam Miranda, right, Garifuna, Afro-Indígena, has been ringing this bell. Berta Cáceres had been ringing this bell, right? If our folks are migrating and being absorbed into the criminal justice system in the state, right? Being absorbed into and being relabeled criminal, right? Who then stays behind? And I think that creates the very vacuum, the power vacuum, right? For transnational companies come in and take the rest of the land, right? For there to be a unraveling of any resistance movement that exists. Because as I mentioned, it's an éxodo when it leaves Honduras, right? Ellos vienen y salen, ellos entienden, right? But what is being projected in academic and political spaces in the States, in the US, is that these are economic migrants, and that's it, without drawing the connection to US interests, US investment in the country.
Thank you so much, Lulu. And precisely, this is one of the reasons why, for example, the teachers union in Honduras wanted to approach this issue, because as Daisy mentioned earlier, you know, they began to see the changes in their classroom. I mean, literally students, you know, desks empty, right? The classroom totally empty all of a sudden, the neighborhoods, the communities, and also the way, like you say, right, who stays behind. And so families are being separated in that sense, right? So not just the communities, you know, a father or the mother and a child will leave, but then the home, right? In that home, there's one person or two people that are missing now, and in that neighborhood and in that community and so on. And so there's, they have been developing the concept of Paulo Freire regarding empty houses, ¿verdad? Las casas vacías de Daisy Márquez, right? Que COPEM está trabajando, de eso estoy hablando, Daisy, que precisamente responde a eso, ¿verdad? Acerca de quién se queda atrás, ¿verdad? Se quedan, como dice muy bien Lulu, estas corporaciones, estos intereses políticos detrás. Así que no sé si quieres mencionar eso. Well, sorry, I just say the same thing in Spanish and telling Daisy if she wanted to comment on the empty homes and this, the theories and the methodologies of Paulo Freire to approach precisely this pedagogical issue in the high schools or in schools, in education.
Sí, desde COPEN estamos retomando la propuesta de que hacía el maestro Paulo Freire en relación a la casa semivacía, donde hemos analizado con docentes de todo el país en qué condiciones quedan las personas aquí en Honduras y en qué condiciones se van a encontrar las personas que salen de Honduras. Es una casa semivacía donde los docentes se concientizan sobre el trato, la forma de manejar el tema de migración en las aulas de clase. Los problemas que tenemos de indisciplina, porque muchos de estos jóvenes se quedan con vecinos, con parientes, con sus, principalmente sus abuelas, y ellos pierden el control disciplinario de estos jóvenes. Entonces, estar en las aulas de clase con estos problemas, entonces requiere un compromiso mayor de los docentes para asumir como un papel maternalista o paternalista de formación de valores en estos jóvenes para que si ellos deciden en el futuro salir de nuestra patria, entonces conocen ya los riesgos que esto involucra, pero que si se quedan aquí en nuestra patria, entonces también asumir un compromiso de luchar para que estos gobiernos nos les brinden todas las condiciones para gozar de los derechos humanos que la misma Constitución y los tratados internacionales le brindan a los y las hondureñas. Entonces, la casa semivacía de Paulo Freire es eso, un tema de concientización de la condición en que se quedan los jóvenes y que añoran las personas que salen de nuestra patria, porque ellos siempre añoran regresar a la patria, comer la comida que nosotros comemos acá, compartir con los vecinos, con la familia, pero a muchos de ellos no se les cumple ese sueño de regresar a su tierra natal, sino que muchos fracasan en el camino porque son objetos de la violencia y todos los peligros que involucra salir sin documentos de la patria. Entonces, cuando construimos estas herramientas en el aula de clase, tomamos en cuenta que en Honduras hay 5 departamentos de los 18 con mayores índices de migración y son los departamentos con mayores índices de producción. Entonces, ¿qué está indicando esto? Que en Honduras ya no se sigue cultivando la tierra, que muchos jóvenes no tienen acceso a campos industriales como son las maquilas, sino que se van tras el sueño americano o el sueño europeo, esperanzados de que van a obtener mejores condiciones de vida. Entonces, esta es la situación que tenemos en Honduras. Como les digo, no es algo nuevo, siempre ha ocurrido, solo que hoy el mundo se ha dado cuenta que Honduras es un país que no tiene ni los requerimientos básicos para gozar de salud, educación, alimentación y trabajo. Y que por eso esta gente está saliendo. Y claro, comparto con la compañera que tiene un trasfondo político. ¿Por qué? Porque estamos sometidos en un narcoestado donde se sabe que las mayores autoridades militares, policiales, familiares del presidente, ¿verdad? Y todos están involucrados en el tema del narcotráfico. Entonces, pero es un gobierno que al pueblo no le da lo que necesita y entonces tiene que salir a buscarlo. Entonces, eso es lo que estamos viviendo en Honduras y como docentes, pues el compromiso y la responsabilidad que tenemos es muy, muy grande, ¿verdad? y esperamos que este año pues lleguemos a más institutos de todo el país para trabajar estas estrategias pedagógicas que hemos construido y que el mayor beneficiado sea el estudiante o la estudiante que nos espera a diario en las aulas de clase, para que los orientemos, los formemos y que ellos sepan que solo el pueblo salva al pueblo.
Muchísimas gracias a todos y todas. Thank you so much to everyone, to Yurissa Varela, to Jackie McVicar, to Lulu Matute, and to Daisy Marquez also for jumping in this conversation. I want to thank everybody that joined from different parts of Canada, as well as some from the United States. I know that Dawn Wright from Amnesty International was also on the webinar. So Dawn, if you're there and you wanted to share the link to some of the urgent actions that people mentioned, that would be great as well. Thank you, Dawn, for sharing that urgent action on amnesty.ca. So thank you so much again, and we'll continue in contact with everyone. Gracias. Again, aquí está el equipo. Chao. Gracias.